here we have an argument that talks about the pineal gland and the manner in which it governs the person's sleep-wake cycle, right? If they're saying normally, they're effectively talking about people with normal vision. So what happens in people with normal vision? There's a pineal gland that governs the sleep-wake cycle of the person by secreting an appropriate level of melatonin, and this appropriate level of melatonin is secreted in response to changes in light and darkness, which are detected, of course, by the eye. All right. Then the argument goes on to say that there are many people who have lesions in their visual cortex. So effectively, talking about injuries, right? Injuries to the visual cortex, and they are blind. Now, if they are blind and they have injuries to the visual cortex, one would expect them to not maintain a sleep-wake cycle. But according to the argument, they can. That means the pineal gland is secreting an appropriate level of melatonin to maintain the sleep-wake cycle, which means it is receiving signals that indicate light or darkness from the eye, right? So effectively, the argument then comes to the conclusion, putting two and two together, what it observed about people with normal vision and people who are blind because of injuries to the visual cortex. And the conclusion is that the neural pathway by which the pineal gland receives signals that indicate that it's night or day, or it's there's a huge amount of light, or probably it's dark right now, that neural pathway does not pass to the visual cortex. Effectively, we are saying that it goes straight from the eye to the pineal gland. All right. Now, before we go anywhere with this argument, we need to understand and we need to take in the fact that this whole arrangement of the sending of signals from the eye to the pineal gland through a neural pathway that does not pass through the visual cortex is applicable to both people with normal vision as well as people who are blind because of lesions in the visual cortex, correct? The argument came to that conclusion on the basis of what it saw in people with normal vision and then considered what happens in people who are blind because of injuries to their visual cortex. So obviously this conclusion applies to both, right? This is the conclusion of the argument, and this is what we have to evaluate. All right. Now, in the case of an evaluate question, of course, these are your options you'll need to consider. You'll obviously need to consider one particular option that weakens and strengthens the conclusion of the argument. Okay, all right. So notice all of them start with whether, right? So when you have a sentence that starts with whether, effectively that sentence is talking about two possibilities: if something happens and if something does not happen, right? So let's consider A. Let's look at A and understand this particular concept of whether. So now when you say whether melatonin supplements, A says whether melatonin supplements help people who have difficulty maintaining a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle to establish such a pattern. It's asking you to consider two possibilities: whether melatonin supplements help people who have difficulty maintaining a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle to establish such a pattern, and whether melatonin supplements do not help people who have difficulty maintaining a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle to establish such a pattern. Now, in both cases, in the help and the do not help cases, both refer to melatonin supplements, okay? And they're referring to people who have difficulty maintaining a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle. Nowhere in the argument has anything been mentioned about melatonin supplements. That's one. It's also not talking about people who have difficulty maintaining a sleep-wake cycle, right? So obviously this is considering aspects that are out of scope of the argument. So consequently, I cannot consider A to evaluate the conclusion. All right. Let's move on to B. B also starts with whether, as you see, or in fact all of them start with whether. So B says whether the melatonin levels of most totally blind people who successfully maintain a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle change in response to changes in light and darkness. So again, you've got to consider two possibilities. One would be if the melatonin levels of these people change in response to changes in exposure to light and darkness, and The other possibility is if the melatonin levels of these people, these blind people who maintain a 24-hour sleep cycle, do not change in response to exposure to light and darkness. Alright, so let's see how we can use B to evaluate our conclusion. And this is our conclusion, right? Applicable to both people with normal vision, people blind due to lesions in the visual cortex. Now we have this information about people who are totally blind and they maintain a sleep-wake cycle, and we have got to check whether how can we evaluate the conclusion on the basis of the information given about people who are totally blind and successfully maintain a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle. Now we have got to consider whether the melatonin levels of these people change or do not change in response to changes in exposure to light and darkness. So what will happen if in these people the melatonin levels change in response to changes in light and darkness? One implication of that is that the pineal gland does secrete an appropriate level of melatonin, correct? And if it is secreting an appropriate level of melatonin to regulate the 24-hour sleep-wake cycle, it is effectively getting that information from the eye, right? It's getting appropriate signals that indicate it's day or night, or indicates there's a huge amount of light or a huge amount of darkness right at this point in time from the eye. So it's getting the signals straight away from the eye, obviously on the basis of our conclusion. So effectively, if it is getting signals straight away from the eye, that neural pathway which takes the signals from the eye to the pineal gland does not probably pass through the visual cortex, correct? This was the conclusion we arrived at, right, when we were analyzing the argument. Okay, so this is what we could prove on the basis of the first possibility, whether the melatonin levels change in response to changes in exposure to light and darkness. Now we've got to take into consideration what will happen if the melatonin levels do not change. If the melatonin levels do not change, it implies that the pineal gland is not receiving an appropriate level of an appropriate signal from the eye, right, about changes in light and darkness. If it is not receiving it from the eye, then definitely that signal carrier, that neural pathway, which is taking the signals from the eye to the pineal gland, is passing through something that is obstructing its path. And from the information that we have from the argument, we know that the only thing that can obstruct its path at this point in time is a non-functioning visual cortex, right? Correct? Now, see, we're talking about most totally blind people. Obviously, people are blind. If people are blind, they definitely have a defunct visual cortex, correct? Only if you have normal vision will you be able to make use of a visual cortex. But if you are blind, the visual cortex is not made use of. If it is not made use of, it is defunct, not functioning. If it is not functioning, whatever is passing through it will not be able to reach its destination, right? The signal, if the signal is passing through a neural pathway that passes through the visual cortex, it will definitely not be able to reach the pineal gland. So effectively, yeah, from this, from this particular analysis, if the melatonin levels do not change, I know that the signals are not being carried from the eye to the pineal gland on the basis of a conclusion that we drew. And consequently, if they are not being delivered to the pineal gland from the eye, then the neural pathway that carries those signals is probably passing through the visual cortex, correct? So effectively, in this case, in option B, I could effectively strengthen and weaken the conclusion, right? With the first possibility, I proved that yes, it might probably not pass through the visual cortex. And in the second possibility, when I considered whether the melatonin levels do not change, I could prove that the neural pathway does pass through the visual cortex. So I could strengthen as well as weaken the conclusion. Anything that lets you strengthen and weaken the conclusion is something that you can consider as an appropriate answer. Alright, so we have B, which does that, but let's look at C, D, and E as well. Okay. Now, according to C, we have got to consider whether melatonin is the only substance secreted by the pineal gland. So again, two possibilities: if melatonin is the only substance, and if melatonin is not the only substance secreted by the pineal gland. If melatonin is the only substance secreted by the pineal gland, sorry, then what conclusion can we draw from it? Does it help us prove whether the neural pathway passes through the visual cortex or doesn't pass through the visual cortex? No way. On the other hand, even if we consider whether the pineal gland does not secrete only melatonin, then we would want to consider what are the other substances that are secreted. Do we know that? Is there any way of knowing that through the argument? We do not know. Do those substances that are secreted by the pineal gland, do they have an effect on the sleep-wake cycle? Again, we do not know that. All said and done, does this list of implication help us prove or disprove the fact that the neural pathway probably does not pass through the visual cortex? No, it does not. So effectively, I can't consider option C. Let's consider option D. Option D asks us to consider two possibilities: whether most people who do not have a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle nevertheless have a cycle of consistent duration, and if most people who do not have a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle nevertheless do not have a cycle of consistent duration. Now, if they have a cycle of consistent duration, how do they maintain that cycle of consistent duration? See, it's not a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle. It's a sleep-wake cycle of a different duration, but it is consistent. It might be shorter. I don't know that. Now, I do not know many things about this particular aspect that option D wants me to consider. So if I do not know all of that, I definitely cannot consider it for an evaluation, correct? Again, I don't even know what in these people helps them maintain that cycle of consistent duration. Yes, I know melatonin helps me govern, the melatonin secreted by the pineal gland helps me govern the sleep-wake cycle in people. Alright, but there I'm talking about a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle, as you might notice from the argument. Here we are talking about a cycle that is of consistent duration, definitely not a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle, correct? So probably there's something else that helps them maintain that cycle in addition to melatonin. Probably melatonin is not even responsible for that kind of a cycle of consistent duration. I really don't know. If we do not know that, we definitely cannot consider it as a possible contender for the evaluation of the conclusion, right? So D is not something that I can consider. Alright, as you notice, we do not have the answers to these questions, correct? Alright, E. E asks us to consider two possibilities, right? It says whether. So effectively, we have got to think about if there are any people with normal vision whose melatonin levels respond abnormally to periods of light and darkness, and if there are any people with normal vision whose melatonin levels do not respond normally to periods of light and darkness. Now, on the basis of our conclusion, we know this is what happens in people with normal vision, right? We know that the pineal gland secretes melatonin in response to cycles of light and darkness, and we know that the neural pathway does not pass through the visual cortex, which was our conclusion, right? So effectively, the eye delivers the signals directly to the pineal gland through a neural pathway that goes straight from it to the pineal gland, all right? Now, let's see how we can use option E to evaluate what's going on over. As I said, we have to consider two options: whether the melatonin levels in these people respond abnormally or do not respond abnormally. So now, let's consider whether they change abnormally. Do the melatonin levels change abnormally? Yes, they do. Possible implication: the pineal gland receives signals from the eye, right, on the basis of our conclusion. If it receives signals from the eye, the other possible implication is that the neural pathway does not probably pass through visual cortex, which is definitely a conclusion, yeah? So yes, definitely it supports the conclusion, no problem. Now let's consider what happens, what will be the implications if we consider whether the melatonin levels do not change abnormally. See, if they do not change abnormally, that means they change normally, correct? If they change normally, then definitely the pineal gland is getting signals from the eye again, right? If it is receiving signals from the eye, the obvious implication on the basis of what we know and on the basis of what we are considering in option E is that the signals probably do not the neural pathway, that carries the signals, does not probably pass through the visual cortex. In both cases, it just helped me support the conclusion, right? And since this is an evaluate question, I've got to look for an option that strengthens and weakens the conclusion. This one doesn't help me weaken the conclusion at all, so effectively I can't consider option E. So on the basis of our analysis of all the 5 options, we can definitely come to the conclusion that B is the one that very ideally helps us evaluate the conclusion. And what is the conclusion? Whether the neural pathway that carries signals in response to detected by the eye in response to light and darkness probably does not pass through the visual cortex. It effectively helps me strengthen that conclusion as well as weaken that conclusion. So yes, B is our answer.